right, everyone. Welcome to episode 7 of the Interdisciplinary History Podcast. I'm Victoria.
And I'm Sloan.
So today we got a really awesome episode ahead. We just got out of an interview with Dr. Seika Boye about the exhibition she put on over at the Mitchell Art Gallery at MacEwan University, which is the university that Sloan and I both go to. It's called It's About Time, Dancing Black in Canada, 1900 to 1970. And it's been a traveling exhibition, but it's been most recently here in Edmonton, and it was just incredible. I really enjoyed it. How about you, Sloan?
I thought it was great. I was very excited that Dr. Boye gave us her time. If our listeners are interested in seeing the archival exhibit, we will have a link in the description. It's a really awesome digitized format of the exhibition. You can walk around, you can read what's up on the walls, you can see what's been spread out. So yeah, I strongly encourage you guys to do that. We talked to Dr. Boye mostly about that, but we do just also get some great input from her about researching in general, about social history in general, and about archiving oral histories. So we hope you enjoy. We're going to play that interview now. Do you want us to introduce you? We did write something up just kind of based off your faculty page, but we also know sometimes guests like to introduce themselves.
Please go ahead and introduce me. That would be great. Thank you.
Awesome. So today we are thrilled to be hearing from Dr. Seika Boye about her archival exhibit, It's About Time, Dancing Black in Canada, 1900 to 1970. Dr. Seika Boye is assistant professor at the University of Toronto who teaches in the Centre for Drama, Theatre, and the Performing Arts. She is the director of the research-oriented Institute for Dance Studies and has more than a decade of professional performance experience. Dr. Boye's research explores Blackness and dancing in Canada, as well as embodied learning and pedagogy. In addition to the It's About Time exhibit, she has also co-curated Into the Light, Eugenics and Education in Southern Ontario, and she is currently a co-investigator on Gatherings, Archival and Oral Histories of Canadian Performance. She is recipient of the Ontario Graduate Scholarship in 2011 and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada Doctoral Fellowship in 2012 to 2014. She was also a 2019 honoree of the Toronto District School Board's African Heritage Educators Network Arts, and a 2020 recipient of the Lieutenant General's Heritage Trust Award. Thank you so much for giving us your time, Dr. Boye.
Yes. Thank you
for the introduction, Sloan and Victoria. Thanks for inviting me.
We actually heard about your exhibit through seeing all the posters around town and seeing that it at MacEwan University. How did the Mitchell Art Gallery get involved with this?
Thanks for the question, Victoria. And, it's so funny. Also, because of the pandemic, I couldn't come there. And so I had my friend Heather, who was a part of the story of how the exhibition came there, and gallery director and curator Carolyn Jervis telling me about the different signs and things that were around campus. And I'm sorry I didn't get to see them. But the story is that Professor Heather Fitzsimmons-Frey, who works in the Arts and Cultural Management program at MacEwan. She is faculty there. We did our PhDs together at the University of Toronto in the Centre for Drama, Theatre and Performance Studies from 2010 to 2016. And so she really saw the development of my work. She was one of the frequent and current readers of my work, and we became very close friends, both in scholarship and between our families. I have 2 sons. She has 4 kids. And so when she got the job at MacEwan, she told me about this amazing new gallery that had opened. And she wrote and said, I just took the catalog from your exhibition into the gallery and left it with the director there, Carolyn Jervis. I think she's doing fantastic work. And that led to some emails and a meeting between Carolyn and I. And then I came out to Edmonton in 2019 in the spring and had a preliminary visit. And from there, the exhibition was programmed and we moved forward. So it really was that direct connection and someone traveling across the country and making those connections.
That's awesome.
That's amazing. Yeah. And I understand that the exhibition also took on some additional, like, Alberta source material, is that correct?
That's right. I felt that it was really important to acknowledge the local history and local artists. And so the exhibition, which is about dance in Canada, really grew out of my dissertation research, which was very much focused on Toronto. But as part of the contextual work that I did around that, I was really looking at the legislation of Black bodies in the Canadian nation state, in particular shifts that happened to immigration laws from 1900 and onward. And so a lot of the material I have is from archives here in Ontario. There are some other things that are from across the country, in Montreal as well, some Vancouver. But in working in Alberta, which of course has its own very rich Black history, I wanted to include some of that. Heather and I drove up to the Amber Valley, and I also met with a number of artists who were working in Edmonton currently, who are. And I also really wanted to find a way to connect to the contemporary moment in addition to connecting to local history. And so there were sort of two different manifestations of working with Alberta-based artists. There were artists who were invited to contribute to the installed exhibition. And so Preston Pavlis and Braxton Garneau, Michelle Moss, who is based in Calgary, Cheryl Fogo, who is also based in Calgary, and Ashley Perez, who is from Calgary but now lives in Toronto. And so they became a part of that installed exhibition. And then we also invited artists who are based in Edmonton and working now to respond to the exhibition itself. So we really wanted to build community and create conversation and discourse and connection around this history, because it's a history that so many people don't know about. And I think it was certainly one of the most rewarding parts of the experience was watching that community form, because there were people who hadn't met one another, who were working in the same city, in similar disciplines, with similar questions, and they got to know each other around the exhibition, which is great.
That's awesome. Yeah, so you mentioned how the artists who contributed work, did they reach out to you or did you reach out to them?
I reached out to them, and it really was a mixture. So Ashley and Michelle, I know they're both dance artists, and I've known them for a number of years. And Cheryl Fogo I had met at a conference in Calgary, 4 or 5 years ago. I heard her do a reading of an excerpt from a work of hers, and I went and talked to her afterwards, and of course just told her how much I admired her work. And we connected there and said, we have to find a way to work together again sometime in the future. And this was the perfect opportunity. And then Braxton and Preston, Carolyn introduced me to their work, and I also came across their work individually as I was looking at visual artists based in Edmonton. I really wanted to meet new people and not only invite people that I know already or knew already. And so that was how that community of folks came together. And then the dance artists who responded, and other artists, Christina Battle, Boye, Yvonne, Sherelle, Masani, they were really folks who were put onto my radar by people in community. Carolyn, Jerry, who runs Mile Zero Dance, who I know from my dancing life, Heather, and then Michelle and Ashley. So a number of people, but the amazing thing was that as we were talking about dance artists who were working locally in a number of different dance forms, all of these connections became apparent. Like Masani and Ashley grew up dancing together, and Masani learned to dance from Michelle, and Michelle and Cheryl were both in Calgary around the same time in the 80s. So it was really wonderful to see that emerge, but they were all invited.
Awesome. Yeah.
That sounds so amazing. I'm curious, I guess you've explained a lot about how you've met the contemporary artists that your work is focused on. I'm curious about sort of the methodology that goes into like the archiving of all this info. Can you talk a little bit about what that process is when you're actually digging into the history?
Sure. The way that I've come to define my practice in a nutshell is looking for things that appear not to be there. So for a long time, when I would search Black dance in Canada or Black ballet, 1950s, I would get results, and these are in digitized newspaper archives, for example, that were, ballet dancers wore a black leotard. I wasn't finding the information that I want. And in part, I wasn't using the language of the day. The way that Black people were referred to in the 1930s, 40s, 50s were Negro. So when I started changing the search terms, the results were different. I also, when going into bricks and mortar archives and looking through different collections, the same thing was true in terms of things weren't categorized there as being about Black dance. I really had to look at other histories to find threads and traces. And one of the key findings for me early on in my PhD was a collection of women's labor histories by Dion Brand. She had led this project and interviewed a number of women who had been, a number of Black women who had been working as domestics for the most part in the 20s, 30s, 40s in Southern Ontario. And in reading through those histories, they all started to refer to these community dances that would happen on Thursdays because that was the night that the domestics had off in Toronto, for example. And so when they would name an organization or a place or some other little thread, that was something that I could follow. And University Settlement House was one example of a place that people mentioned often in those histories. So that's an example of, it's like detective work, really. If you've done any archival research, you know how much of it is just following the notes and hoping to find things and then making other connections and having conversations and oral history interviews to work alongside the objects, paper ephemera, newspaper articles, photographs that I found in the archive. They're limited in terms of what they can tell me, but I was fortunate enough to be able to also do oral history interviews with community members who had been around in Toronto at that time.
That's so fascinating, like, to think about.
It is. It really is. I love the fact that you used oral history interviews. I feel like sometimes that those can be kind of just shoved to the side, and I think oral history is such an important part of learning about the past, just having that sort of record.
Certainly, I agree with you entirely. And there's a great book that you might be interested in called Oral History Theory, written by a woman and scholar named Lynn Abrams. And she situates the development of the oral history interview as it's used institutionally as something that emerged following World War II and the importance of recording the experience of Holocaust survivors. And so and how it then became a tool of documenting histories that that perhaps didn't have other traces, or that people might try to cover up, or state a claim that something didn't happen. And it's a wonderful book because it talks about how the ethics around the oral history interview have shifted over time to be sure that they provide both context but also autonomy and agency on the part of the people being interviewed, so that the interviews don't only serve the researcher. It's great. I highly recommend it.
Thank you. I'll have to check that out.
And I understand you're currently still working on a lot of oral histories with the Gatherings project?
Yeah, that's right. Gatherings is a project of scholars from across the country, and I can share the website with you. It's a sprawling project. I'm trying to think about how to describe it. But an example is that right now, some colleagues and I'm working in partnership with Professor Sasha Kovacs, who's at the University of Victoria, and we're steering the virtual exhibitions component of the research project. And of course, we can't go without acknowledging 2020, both in terms of the pandemic, but also in terms of social justice actions that have been taking place globally. And so we really started to recognize that Zoom gatherings, Zoom meetings, Zoom conferences, not conferences as much, but panels and conversations around social justice in performance were becoming a very important part of this moment in time, but also a new type of archival object that we have to think carefully about how to document it. How do you deal with a transcript? How do you make sure that it doesn't get lost in the, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Zoom events that are happening that so many of us can't watch in real time because we're zoomed out at the end of the day, but that are available online for us to watch later on. And so how do we start to bring some context and sort of gravity to some really important conversations that have happened that wouldn't have happened otherwise, because one person's over here and another person's over here and the time zones are different, and usually they'd be traveling and it would take 2 years to get them into a room together. And suddenly everyone's sitting in their living room and it takes 2 weeks to get them online together and create an event. So I think that speaks to the fact that the Gatherings Project, yes, is about the history of performance in Canada, but it's also thinking about how to document the current moment.
Mm-hmm. That's very exciting.
That's really cool. Yeah, because one of the things that I've been thinking throughout this whole pandemic is how do we record this? Like, how do we record all this sort of stuff that's been going on? One thing I've been thinking about is like open access, how easy it is to access stuff right now, whereas before the pandemic, things were not as easy to sort of get access to.
It is a great thing for us all to consider, right? I hope that some of it remains. I mean, I hope a lot of the access remains, but unfortunately, we know that so many structures need to shift in order for that to happen, and value systems need to change. But it's been an exciting time as well for being able to access digitized performance, so recordings of full performances that weren't available before. And there are a lot of important conversations happening around access in that way as well. So I hope that it's something that we can carry forward when the pandemic is behind us or has shifted into a new phase of our contemporary moment.
Yeah. Victoria and I both got to experience It's About Time through the digital experience, and it was neat the way you moved through that. I'm curious, because this exhibition got to be in a couple of places before 2020 hit, can you tell us a little bit about what the response was like and how you feel about the response?
Yeah, I mean, it's always... I think first and foremost, I'll say, as someone whose first practices as a dancer and a performer, my engagement with the public was always very much in the moment. I would, rehearse with people for months, and then you give a performance for a few nights, or you go on tour and you're performing again for a few nights, and then you move on somewhere else. And the response is immediate, right? It's applause, or it's other kinds of engagement, or the conversations in the lobby afterwards. And so moving into curation as a way of engaging with the public and sharing with the public is still something that is feels a little bit strange or unfamiliar to me in terms of not being there with it. You're there at the opening of an exhibition, but then you walk away from it and it stays there. And so you don't see people experiencing it. And this was just one more time removed from that, in that I didn't ever stand in the room in the installed exhibition. All of that is to say that the response was really wonderful. There are always emails that are sent, or the online engagement through social media and that kind of thing. But what was so valuable to me this time around were the artist responses to the exhibition. And Yvonne was really brilliant in the way that he approached his response, because he recorded, and I don't know if you've seen these when they were up on social media. They're going to be shared again. I'll be sharing them. There's a website that is being developed that is got a comprehensive website of the exhibition that will include all of the responses. But he recorded Chirel and Masani experiencing the exhibition for the first time and learning about aspects of Black history in Canada and about dancers they have never, ever, ever heard of. Really about a local history they weren't aware of. And the profound experience that is to learn something you didn't know, and that shifts your sense of who you are in a certain place. And so that's something that I've really carried with me. I'll admit there's a part of me that feels a little bit incomplete in having not been there, but I hope, I don't know, I think that will come around, and I am excited to have the website there to have their responses available in a more permanent place. It was really a social media activation, but that's another thing that disappears and can be harder to trace and hold on to and find. And so I think I'm still processing the exhibition, to be honest. I think I'm still processing that exhibition.
The way you describe it, it almost sounds like it was closer to being published than it was to performing.
Yeah, it is. It is something like that people experience something that they read in a more singular and individual way, although it becomes a shared experience. I teach an Introduction to Drama, Theatre and Performance Studies course at the University of Toronto, and we look at the history of performance through shifts in technology and communication technologies, which of course are, starts with oral, and then it's early handwritten manuscript, and then early print and periodical print, and how as things went into periodical and more people had access to the same thing, they started to have a shared experience or a shared sense of community from their individual and private homes. And I think that we're really going through a moment like that right now, and that we're having a shared experience, but we're all alone, or alone with our families or roommates or whoever it is that we share space with. And yet we're going through something together on a global scale. There are very few places that aren't touched by this pandemic. So yeah, I think you're right that it feels more like that than a performance in the theatrical sense.
Yeah. I've been asking this to some of our other guests. Is there something, like a resource that you've come across during the pandemic that you found useful, not only to research, but also for teaching and stuff?
Yeah, there's a great podcast, actually, because this is a podcast. I've been listening to podcasts a lot more than I did in the past. And there's a great podcast actually called Tea for Teaching. They also love tea and celebrate tea. I had a lot of fun reading your website and why you're doing this podcast. I think it would really be, I can't in this moment, and I will actually send you an email if I think of something more specific. A lot of the amount of access we've had to performances that we didn't have otherwise and before in general has been tremendous. Too often, either performance is unaffordable, even if it's happening down the street from you, or it doesn't happen in the town where you are if you don't live in a major city, or you don't live close enough to a major city. I'm at a bit of a loss, although I have engaged with so many books and so many podcasts. But Tea for Teaching I've loved because I teach, and because we've really had to rethink the way that teaching happens virtually. At the University of Toronto, we didn't have any moment of being in person. It's been a real moment of reflection about what's essential in the ways that we connect together through learning and around learning and to learn. And there's just some great reflection there. I hope that answers okay.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much. I'm going to have a look at that, because that's one of the things that my coworkers and I talk about is how has teaching sort of had to evolve because of this. One time my coworkers and I were talking about the discussion of accessibility and how I feel it's actually kind of better that we're having this option to have the online courses, synchronous and asynchronous lectures, because sometimes with jobs people can't
get the chance to go to classes, especially with accessibility. Like sometimes a disabled student might not be able to actually go to a physical university environment to attend a lecture because there just isn't that sort of accommodation.
Absolutely. I think that there are many positive things that are being discovered through this forum. That's not to say that I don't miss teaching in person tremendously, especially as someone who, I teach a large lecture course, but also small studio courses. But I think we've had to ask some very important, essential questions, both about what we are teaching, but also, as you say, how we're teaching it and who has access and when. We've had to think a lot about access throughout the pandemic. And I think it's always a good thing when we're pressed to think about it more deeply than we have.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything you want to go out saying, or...
Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm so excited that this podcast is happening, and I love that it's an intersectional approach to having fun with history and talking about history and considering why history is important to our contemporary moment and how we understand ourselves. And I think it's great. I'll listen to it certainly in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That means so much to us.
Well, stay safe in Ontario, and I hope everybody around you is happy, or as much as we can be in these times.
Thank you so much, you too, and I wish you both the best with your studies and with the podcast and everything outside of that.
Have a lovely semester.
Thank you. You too.
All right. That was such a cool interview. Seika was amazing, just so kind, and we really appreciate the fact that she talked to us.
Yeah, it was really cool that she responded to us.
She's a University of Toronto professor, and
thank you, Dr.
great
Boye,
that she's giving us her time.
Accepting that type of approach. Before we started recording the interview, she actually shared with us that she decided this year for Black History Month she was only going to say yes to student requests for interviews or events rather than keeping herself in the kind of higher academic world, which I think is really cool and a really powerful choice for her to make. So thank you for that. That's really, really awesome.
Yeah. She was so well spoken, especially like when she was talking about accessibility and how like the pandemic has changed the way we're archiving things, like say the Zoom calls and the situation that we've been dealing with over the past year. It's interesting to see how
I think that
archival research
kind of
up
until this point in our university career been like, oh well, the proverb for future historians is going to be social media and reading through all the Twitter posts and all that sort of thing. And I had never even thought about the fact that someday undergraduate students are going to have to spend hours, possibly just like fast-forwarding through Zoom interviews and looking for the information they're looking for. So that's fun. I would prefer, I think, to be working with microfilm. I think that we hit the sweet middle ground. Because we didn't have to work with microfilm, but we're not going to have to work with the Zoom calls. The thing that stood out to me that she was describing that I thought was like so emblematic of the interdisciplinary approach, because it's something that's really more borrowed from the social sciences, is her use of like the interview techniques, but it sounded very much like she was using the snowballing method, which I don't write much on our blog, because I edit this show. But the last time I did contribute something to the blog, I talked a little bit about the snowball method, which is when you start with a group of participants that you're being interviewed for qualitative research, and then you have that pool of participants put you in touch with other participants. So it snowballs off each other that way. I thought that that was so cool that she was talking about how really that is a way that you can uncover the stuff that wasn't in the records, or the stuff that's hard to find out of the records because it hasn't been a well-defined category so far. When she said that her approach to history is looking for the stuff that's not there yet, that's such a good way to approach the discipline if you want to use it to empower, or affirm, like even just to affirm.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really excited to hear that they're doing a website and having all the responses to the exhibition from the artists who collaborated in there. I think that's gonna be really, really cool, especially because it's gonna give an even more personal angle to it. I love the exhibition.
Absolutely.
Hearing about it from
Absolutely.
the artist's point of
We
view
talked in our
and
last
in their voice,
episode
it's gonna
when
be
we were debating
so
whether or not
incredible.
history is a science. We were talking about kind of the barriers for primary source. And it's funny because my own personal perspective, I would be like, yeah, a photo of a dancer or a recording of a dance recital or sheet music or a recording of music, those are all definitely primary sources. But I don't know if I would have already had categories in my mind that actions themselves are primary sources. And that's what I think is so interesting about the oral history side of it, but this particular framework of investigation, because it's really looking at performances. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think that just the fact that oral history is an integral part of this is what makes it so tangible and such a I found it was a very accessible exhibition, not just because it was online, but because like I felt like you could understand it more because it wasn't done in a way that feels isolating. Like I feel like with a lot of exhibitions that you can feel like that. But hearing everything in people's own words, like seeing the quotes, it felt interdisciplinary in that, because sometimes like I said, we sometimes neglect oral history as an integral part of the primary sources. We forget just how important hearing something like from word of mouth is. It brings history to life in a way that you don't really get to see. I think that's kind of like what we do with this podcast, is like we bring history to life not only in a fun and interdisciplinary way, but we're doing it in a way that's personable. Like, we're making academia less
correct on
like
that.
A chore.
I think the
I feel
fact
like
that
sometimes
this was
academia can feel
art
like
exhibition, but it wasn't just that. She referenced it, and if you follow the link that we have in the description to see the digitized version of it that you can walk through, it's very much, as Dr. Boyd said, about bodies and about legislation and about status. Like, it's very, very powerful. The exhibition has a couple of these, like, timelines that are just changes to legal codes. And it's interesting because I wouldn't have, on my own, immediately thought about the ability to go to a dance hall when we're still talking about segregation, but that is absolutely part of it. And the way that that affects groups' abilities to engage in self-expression in a public sphere.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as well, as like how the control of a population isn't just like segregating like where they can go and who they can speak with. It's also controlling the way they get to live their lives. One part of the exhibition talks about the Sexual Sterilization Act here in Alberta and how that affected the Black population, not only here, but like it did spread across Canada. And like you said, bodies have been legislated here in Canada and around the world. That stood out to me as well, and how even like art can be used as a form of control. Like in the exhibition, there's a glass case featuring a selection of makeup books on makeup, how essentially like how to do blackface, and they talk about how blackface is not only
and we should probably explain that the exhibit itself does predominantly look at Black artists. That's what Dr. Boyd is interested in. That's the main focal point of the exhibition. However, you can't really approach that or do an exhibition on that without also acknowledging that Black performance for a long time was treated as a character, and wasn't always being done by actual Black bodies. So that's, it's not really an exhibition that could be run without having that conversation brought in, and I felt like that was...
Yes, and we still see that this sort of affecting
I
now
feel like
in current media.
it made the
exhibition we still see relatively
a bit more
recently in
context grounded, that it wasn't just celebrating. Obviously the exhibit does a huge job at celebrating the history of Black dance in Canada, but it doesn't ever let us forget the realities of racism in Canada. Yeah, the reflected values, not good values, but definitely not something to forget about. Like, those primary sources speak to the fact that this wasn't just something that was done. It was something so accepted at the time that you had a manual on how to do it well. And I think that that's something that throughout this exhibition, as I was looking around, because there's dates on everything, it's a well-curated exhibition, of course there would be, how recent every date in there is. Like, my parents are born in 1968. This exhibition is 1900 to 1970. My grandparents were adults by the end of this. And I think that we have a tendency to exaggerate the past because the past is so different than us, and because the past is so different from the values we have today and we want to have today. But as we've kind of talked about before on this show, is if you have a really strong demarcation between the present and the past, you forget the past, or the past becomes less real. And I think Seika talking about how much of hers research has relied on oral history, has been based off of oral history, really helps break down that idea that the past is something separate from us.
Yeah. All right, so before we sign off, Sloan and I would like to acknowledge that this podcast and all of the content we create are located and produced on Treaty 6 territory. This land has traditionally and continues to be a home, place of gathering, and meeting ground for many Indigenous peoples. This includes the Nakota Sioux, Niitsitapi, Métis, Saulteaux, and Cree First Nations. You can find our podcast on all your favorite podcast directories and on YouTube. We just got put onto Podchaser, so if that's your preferred podcast outlet, we now have that there. I'm very excited about that. I will put all of our social medias into the description box below, and please check us out. We post a lot of fun content.
So yeah,
we also have,
we'll have
a blog,
links to
and we're going to have the blog
that we've mentioned that
link
we can
in the
find a
description
link for
box
down
too.
in the description. And we will...
If you would like to guest or have a suggestion for a future episode or blog post topic, please let us know by shooting us an email. I'll also make sure that's in the description box as well. But if you want, you can also reach out to us on our social media pages. I'm always there if you have a question, or if you feel more comfortable talking to us through. Sometimes an email can feel quite daunting. We're really open. We always want to chat with you guys. We love it. We love talking to you all, and it's great. Yeah, so thank you for taking the time to listen to our episode. And stay tuned for our next recording. We're going to have a lot of fun with that one.